have work to do. Let me start with a New York Times report from August 18, 2010. Printed it off. The title is, "What is it about 20-somethings?" How many of you are 20-something? You know, some of you, some of the seniors, the rest of you will get there soon, Lord willing. The subtitle is, "Why are so many people in their 20s taking so long to grow up?" Let me just read a paragraph. "It's happening all over in all sorts of families, not just young people moving back home, but also young people taking longer to reach adulthood overall. It's a development that predates the current economic doldrums, and no one knows yet what the impact will be. On the prospects of young men and women, on the parents on whom so many of them depend, on society built on the expectation of an orderly progression in which kids finish school, grow up, start careers, make a family, eventually retire to live on pensions supported by the next crop of kids who finish school, grow up, start careers, etc. The traditional cycle seems to have gone off course. Young people remain untethered to romantic partners or to permanent homes, going back to school for lack of better options, traveling, avoiding commitments, competing ferociously for unpaid internships or temporary and often grueling Teach for America jobs, forestalling the beginning of adult life. The 20s are a black box, and there's a lot of churning in there. 1/3 of people in their 20s move to a new residence every year. 40% move back home with their parents at least once. They go through an average of 7 jobs in their 20s. So seniors, this is what you have to look forward to. 7 jobs in their 20s. More job changes than in any other stretch. 2/3 spend at least some time living with a romantic partner without being married, and marriage occurs later than ever. The median age at first marriage in the early 1970s, when baby boomers were young, was 21 for women, 23 for men. By 2009, it had climbed to 26 for women and 28 for men. Now, that may not seem like a lot, but that's 5 years in a little over a generation. Just another indication that your generation, 20-somethings, my generation, 30-somethings, are finding it harder and harder to know what to do. Let me give you another article. This is from a website called larknews.com. It has fake Christian news. It's like the Christian version of The Onion. It's pretty funny. I don't know if this is funny, but I thought it was. The title, so this is fake, but it could be real. The title is "Man, 91, Dies Waiting for the Will of God." Tupelo, Mississippi. Walter Houston, described by family members as a devout Christian, died Monday after waiting 70 years for God to give him clear direction what he was to do in life. He hung around the house and prayed a lot, but just never got that confirmation, his wife Ruby says. Sometimes he thought he had heard God's voice, but then he wouldn't be sure, and he'd start the process all over again. Houston, she says, never really figured out what his life was about, but felt content to pray continuously about what the Lord might have for him. Whenever he was about to take action, he would pull back because he didn't want to disappoint God or go against him in any way. He was very sensitive to always finding and remaining in God's will. That was primary to him. Walter had a number of skills he never got around to using, says longtime friend Timothy Burns. He worked very well with wood and had a storyteller's side to him. I always told him, take a risk, try something if you're not happy. But he was too afraid of letting the Lord down. You've all heard of baby boomers. Your parents, perhaps. They're that generation born roughly in the late 40s, 50s, maybe early 60s. Maybe more my parents, yours are a little younger. But the baby boomers, and since then, people have liked to put on labels for different generations. And so, is this generation the Gen Xers, the Gen Y, the Millennials? What are we called? Well, Robert Wuthnow, who's a sociologist, has dubbed a new term for 21 to 45-year-olds. He calls them, us, tinkerers. It used to be that 30 seemed old and far away. And now it's not uncommon that you will hear people talk about coming of age at 40. This generation are full of tinkerers. Any of you play with tinker toys when you were kids? Okay, it's all right. You've heard of tinker toys? There's like 80 years old or something. So it's just not wasn't my generation, but you play with these little sticks and these little spools, and you put things together, and you just kind of tinkered around. And he says that's what our generation is full of. Now, he says there's some pluses to that. We're more flexible. We're willing to try new things. We're open to new opportunities, but we don't settle down. We don't make decisions. We tinker. And part of this translates into a delay in becoming an adult, growing up. Now, I remember distinctly the year 1985. None of you were born, but I was 8. And I remember 1985 for two things. One, my family moved from the Chicago area to Grand Rapids. And so we moved into a new house, a new place. I remember that. And number two, it was the year the Bears went to the Super Bowl. I'm a Chicago Bears fan, and they had the Super Bowl shuffle, and they were one of the best teams ever. So I remember 1985. And I can remember my parents, and I was 8. My oldest son is now 7, roughly the same age. And for all I knew, my parents could have been 100 years old. They were just my mom and dad. And I never thought of anything of how old they were. They were just parents, and they were old. But now I look back and I think, my mom, this is going to be recorded, but you can figure out how old she is. She was 35 at the time. My dad was 36. I'm 33. And I think, either they were really young or I'm getting old. But the thing that I recall now is that it just seemed very normal. They just seemed grown-ups, adults, 35, 36. They had 4 kids. They had a job, had a house, had a career, and here I was, and they were I don't know how old they were. They were just parents. They were adults. And increasingly, that is the exception rather than the rule. To meet someone who is 35 and 36 and has all their kids and has a job and done with school, so many people in your generation, my generation, are tinkerers. Just consider one statistic, just one. In 1960, 77% of women and 65% of men completed all the major transitions into adulthood by age 30. These transitions included leaving home, finishing school, becoming financially independent, getting married, having a child. So those, you just kind of, there's no Bible verse that says you have to do all of those things, and that if you don't do them by a certain age, you're sinning. But just those are kind of the major life transitions. You're no longer a child, you're an adult. You finish school, you're financially independent, you're not relying on mom and dad, you're on your own, you're married, you have a kid. Those major life transitions. In 1960, 77% of women and 65% of men had completed those by age 30. By 2000, so 40 years later, only 46% of women completed those transitions by age 30, and only 31% of men. I think about it. That is really a remarkable change. It's really stunning. 1/3, then, of men roughly my age, or to put another way, 2/3 of men roughly my age have not completed these transitions into adulthood, where they're financially independent, they're done with school, they're married, they have a child, that's what you think of an adult. Something has happened. Something has changed. Now, I need to be quick to say there are lots of good reasons why someone may be in school past 30, lots of good reasons why someone may not be financially independent, especially in this economy. I know godly, hard-working men who love their families and want to provide for them, and they just can't find work. And some of them have to move back home with mom and dad. So I understand that there are many challenges, but that is not always the case. If it doesn't automatically mean that you're a moocher and a lazy bum and a self-indulgent vagabond trying to find yourself, it possibly could mean that. It possibly could mean that. It may mean that our unparalleled freedom to roam and experiment has not actually made us any wiser or more mature. Perhaps our free spirit needs less freedom and more faithfulness. Now, what does all this have to do with the will of God? Well, we're getting there. I think this hesitancy to make decisions is both the fruit and the root, that is, the result and the cause, related to this search for God's will. So here's what I mean. This is this new change in young people, not growing up, not making decisions, what some people have called adultolescence. You have adolescence, you have adulthood. Now this is this middle ground of adultolescence that lasts through the 20s and the 30s. Now, how this relates to God's will. First, it is the fruit, because nothing is settled anymore after high school or even after college. I don't know if they do this in California, but in the Midwest, this was very strange to my wife because she grew up on the East Coast. In the Midwest, when you graduate from high school, you have a big open house. And maybe you don't know what this is, but your parents they get all the ham and buns and have all the punch with the sherbet in it, and they open up the house, and all your friends come, and everyone in the high school has an open house. And you pass out these little cards, and you sort of take pride, and you say, look, I'm going to 60 open houses. And you just, for 2 months straight, you just mooch off of people every Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. You just go to these things, and it's sort of celebrating, yes, you've finished high school. And I think that's a holdover from a day when that was kind of the last hurrah. That's what you did. You finished high school, and maybe you grew up on the farm, or you now were heading off and you were going to be a teacher, and you're done. Well, who thinks high school is done anymore? No, if we all go to college, you're in college. And who thinks that you would actually trust a recent high school graduate to act like an adult? Sorry, freshmen, but it's just, we don't expect very much of high school graduates. So, when you finish and you have the whole world is open to you, now you have all this indecision, all this hesitancy, and so into that comes a search for God's will, because nothing is clear. So you think, God, what am I supposed to do? Now that's the fruit. Now the root is that our search for the will of God, I fear, has become an accomplice in the postponing of growing up. So too many of us have passed off our passivity, our instability, our indecision, and we have spiritualized that and said, I'm waiting, I'm searching for the will of God. And so now, instead of encouraging people to grow up, we say, no, that you may be the most spiritual one in the room because you're waiting. You're not doing anything. You're constantly hesitant. And so we see not making up our minds and meandering through life as marks of spiritual sensitivity. And the result is we become tinkerers when we should make a decision, do something. Now, how do we understand the will of God? Let me invite you to turn to some Bible passages. If you don't have your Bible, you can follow along. And just so you know, we are not going to go for 3 hours or 2 hours straight. We will take a break, because there's donuts, and I like donuts. How do we understand the will of God? The Bible talks about the will of God in at least 2 different ways. On the one hand, there is what we can call a will of decree. A will of decree. God has ordained everything that comes to pass. He decrees, and it is so. Let me give you some verses. Ephesians 1:11, in Him we have obtained an inheritance, having been predestined according to the purpose of Him who works all things according to the counsel of His will. So you hear that God works all things after the counsel of His will. The fact that you're here is according to God's will. It doesn't say just the big things or the little things. All things God is working after the counsel of His will. Matthew 10:29-30, are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny, and not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father, but even the hairs of your head are all numbered. Not even a bird falls to the ground apart from the will of God. I praise God that He micromanages. He's not just into kind of getting the big picture. He knows even hairs on your head. He not only knows birds falling to the ground, not one falls apart from His will, that God would ordain that to be. He's a sovereign God. Psalm 139, verse 16, your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there were none of them. So God has written in His book all of your days before any of them come to pass. He has sovereignly decreed what will become of us. So our lives unfold according to God's providence. I grew up in the Reformed Church. We had to learn the Heidelberg Catechism. Most of you have probably not heard of the Heidelberg Catechism. It's from the 16th century. I would commend it to you. It's very readable. It's very personal. And here's what the Catechism defines as providence. Providence is the almighty and ever-present power of God, by which He upholds, as with His hand, heaven and earth and all creatures, and so rules them that leaf and blade, rain and drought, fruitful and lean years, food and drink, health and sickness, prosperity and poverty, all things, in fact, come to us not by chance, but from His fatherly hand. I think that's right. All things. We don't believe in fate. We don't believe in chance. Now don't freak out if somebody says good luck to you. Okay, we know what they mean. Well, you don't believe in the Bible, there's no luck. Oh, just relax. But no, we don't believe that things just happen because they happen. All things, the good things, the bad things, they come to us from God's gracious fatherly hand. So that's the will of God's decree. Augustine said the will of God is the necessity of all things. By that he meant whatever God wills comes to pass, and whatever comes to pass has been willed by God. There's a lot of questions we could talk about there, but let me move on. So that's one way the Bible talks about the will of God. There's another way. Not a will of decree, but what we might call a will of desire. So let me give you some passages. 1 John 2, 15 through 17. Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh and the desires of the eyes, pride and possessions, is not from the Father but from the world. And the world is passing away along with its desires, but whoever does the will of God abides forever. Now, did you hear that? The will of God is put opposite the desires of the world. So you see the difference? The first passages I was reading talked about the will of God is whatever happens, God decrees it. Here, same phrase, but it's used differently. Now the will of God is what God wants us to do, how He wants us to live. And so the first will of God can never be thwarted. God does whatever He pleases. But in this other sense, God's will of decree, we can disobey. Give you another example, Matthew 7:21. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father. Again, we see the will of God here is shorthand for obedience to God's commands. In this sense, not everyone does the will of God, what He desires. Now, what warrant do we have for seeing the will of God in these two different ways? Now, admittedly, there's no Bible passage that says, here's one way to look at it, and here's a second. But there's at least one passage that hints at these two different aspects to God's will. Deuteronomy 29:29, the secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things that are revealed belong to us and to our children forever, that we may do all the words of this law. The secret things belong to the Lord our God. The things revealed belong to us and to our children. So he's saying there are some things that only God knows. That's His will of decree. But then there are things that He has told us about, and those things are for us to understand. So we have a will of decree, we have a will of desire. Now here's the real heart of the matter. Does God also have a will of direction that He means for us to find out ahead of time? That's probably why you're here. Will of God. When you hear will of God, you think direction. What am I supposed to do? Who am I supposed to marry? Where am I supposed to live? So does the Bible teach that God has a will of direction for each of you that you are supposed to find out ahead of time? And I want to suggest that the answer is no. But let me explain. Yes, God has a specific plan for your life. Yes, we can be assured that He is working all things for our good. Yes, looking back over our lives, we will be able to trace God's ways sometimes. We'll see, oh, now I realize why I got that job and not that job, and why I moved into that neighborhood. But does God have a will of direction for our lives that He means for us to discover ahead of time? That second half of the sentence is key. Yes, God has a will of direction for each one of us. He has a plan. No, He does not mean for us to find it out ahead of time. So, I'm not saying that God won't help you make decisions. It's called wisdom, and we'll at least talk about that briefly. I'm not saying God doesn't care about your future. I'm not saying He isn't in control of your life. I believe in His providence with all my heart. What I am saying is we should not think of God's will like a bullseye. Heard that analogy before? You have this bullseye, and there's maybe kind of the 25-point ring of God's will, and the 50, and then there's right in the middle. You know, those fortunate people who can say, I am in the center of God's will. Other people just have to settle for, I'm kind of in the periphery of God's will. I'm just sort of about 5 degrees off of God's will. But some people are in the center. That's how we talk about it. Or we think of it as sort of a tightrope. Here I am, I'm going to graduate college, and what do? I've got to find God's will, and it's walking on this tightrope, and if I make one wrong move and I get in the wrong program, I move to the wrong state, all of a sudden I've fallen off, and I'm not in God's will anymore. Or a corn maze. This shows that I spent time in Iowa. Do they have corn mazes in California? Yes? No. Not in Orange County? Not in Santa Barbara? So you go, they let the corn grow up taller than you, and then they mow a path through it, and it's a maze. And sometimes we think of God's will that way, and you get to a dead end, and you can turn left or turn right, and you think, if I turn right, I've just missed God's best for my life. Okay, another example that won't relate to you, but when I was a child, we had these choose-your-own-adventure books. Anyone remember those? A few little smiles. So you'd read these. I loved these books. They were so fun, and they had, a lot of the pages had 3 sentences on them. So it was a great way to just flow through books. And you'd have all the bad guys chasing you, and then you'd get to this cliffhanger in the book, and it would say, if you want to get on the plane and fly to Brazil, turn to page 15. If you want to hide out in this cave, turn to page 72. And so you'd turn to 72 and you'd hide out in the cave, and then you'd turn to those pages and say, that cave was a volcano. You're dead when you're gone. Oh, and some of us think of God's will that way. It's a choose-your-own-adventure novel. And I have this decision to make, and you want to sort of peek ahead to page 72. Is this another volcano? And I'm going to die. You make the wrong choice and you're goners. Now, why are we so desperate to find out God's will? Let me give you 5 reasons, then maybe we'll have some time for some discussion, and then we'll take a break. Why are we so desperate to figure out God's will? Number 1, we want to please God. We want to please God. You think, if there's a right job I'm supposed to take, I want to find it out. If there's a place that I'm supposed to live that God has set aside for me, I want to go there. If I'm supposed to marry this person and this other person would be disobedient, then I want to know that. So there's a sincere desire, God, I want to please you. I want to know what's right. That's one reason. But there are other reasons that are mingled in with that one. Number 2, some of us are by nature quite timid and hesitant. It's true, there are entrepreneurial, sort of go-getter types, and they may be less inclined to fret over God's will. And some Christians need an encouragement to think before they act. But many of us need an encouragement to actually act after we think. I have known some impetuous Christians, but in my personal experience, I have known far more Christians who are not impetuous, but are paralyzed by indecision and inactivity. You see this in churches. Churches are almost pathologically incapable of making decisions. And it's not just because there's layers of leadership in the organization. Part of it is, it feels unspiritual to be sure of something. And we come to this sometime in our church where we have to make a decision. Now, what's the first thing someone's going to say? We should really pray about this. And of course we should. But sometimes there's a sense, unless you really agonize over this for weeks and months, you're not ready to make a decision. But sometimes we don't have that luxury in life. And I find most Christians feel like I need 100% of all the facts. I need to know every possible contingency before I'm going to decide anything. And so we're paralyzed. We're timid. We're cautious. You see this in kids sometimes. They quit Little League because they're not the best and they don't want to risk failure. Or the student who slacks off in school because they'd rather do poorly on their own than try to do their best and not meet everyone's expectations. This is what I often think happens with young people who just become slackers. It's not always because they can't do it. They often can. But they have this standard, I need to be an A student. Well, I might actually be a B+. Well, that hurts to be a B+ when people want me to be an A. So I'll just be a D. And I'll set the expectations so low that people can't be disappointed. We're just timid. We're cautious. We're hesitant. These may be the sort of Christians Paul had in mind in Thessalonians when he said, admonish the idle, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak, be patient with them all. So some Christians need to be a little less faint-hearted. I remember reading an article in The Economist after 9/11, and they were having an essay contest. And I think it was just an open-ended essay contest in the aftermath of 9/11. And this person was writing about the nature of risk and how he was feeling like we were becoming, as a country, so averse to any risks. And he had this great line. He said, someday when I'm old and borderline senile and I'm in the retirement home, I hope I can say my life was about something racier than guessing right on the butter versus margarine conundrum. You know, which one is really good for you? Are eggs good for you or they're not good for you? Sugar, no, yes. Coffee, yes, no. So I hope I can say that my life had a little more edge than that. So we're timid. Number 3, we are searching for perfect fulfillment in life. Let's be honest. Now, okay, I don't know your homes, and some of you may have really hard stuff. For most of us, we have had it so good that we have started to think we ought to find heaven on earth. And we think that we ought to have perfect fulfillment in every area of our life. But if we study the Scriptures, we find faith does not guarantee fulfillment. Bruce Waltke, an Old Testament scholar, has this great line looking at Hebrews 11. You know Hebrews 11, the Hall of Fame of Faith? And he comments on the first 3 men who are highlighted in Hebrews 11. He says, you have Abel, he had faith and he died. Enoch had faith and he didn't die. Noah had faith and everyone else died. So just faith by itself is not going to guarantee the outcome. And yet so many of us, and I think some of this is a generational thing, we expect perfect fulfillment. My peers and I, and maybe this is you, we were among the first ones to experience grade inflation, where you're absolutely livid if you don't get an A. We ought to get an A because we tried hard. We did our best at calculus. We ought to do well because we got in touch with our feelings. I had a philosophy class my senior year. No, not knocking the philosophy folks here, but most of the people in their class, they were philosophy types, and they like to sort of think and ponder about things. Well, this particular course was on logic, which is much more like math. And the people in the class were absolutely just aghast that their answers were wrong. Oh, well, no, I think this is right. And the professor just kept saying, I know you think it is, but it's not. You're not getting an A here. I had another professor in seminary. At the start of each of his classes, at the beginning of the semester, he gave this very impassioned speech, which I really didn't like at the time, but looking back, I think was very wise. And the speech went something like this: not all of you are A students, and that's okay. Some of you are B students. Doesn't mean you're not worth as much. Some of you may get a C+. Some of you may choose to do some other things that mean you get a B+ instead of an A-. He said, so don't come to me when you're upset that you didn't get the A you think you deserve. Not everyone is an A student. Well, no one liked to hear that. Well, we maybe did because we thought, I'm glad he's saying that to the other people in this class. We just expect that we ought to be affirmed. We expect that we ought to be fulfilled. Some of us have been prepped for elite schooling since before we could use the potty. We've been on traveling soccer teams since before we knew we couldn't touch the ball with our hands. And we've had all sorts of people praise us regardless of our accomplishments. Just for once, I'd like to hear a graduation speech that says, you know what? You can't do everything you put your mind to. You know what? This is not the best graduating class ever. Frankly, you're not even in the top half, but I like you a lot. But you never hear that. It's rah-rah and go conquer, and you can do whatever you want, and you're Westmont students, and you can change the world. And it's no wonder we expect people to affirm us for everything, criticize us for nothing, pay us for anything we want to do. We figure, I should be able to just graduate, find a job that pays as much as my parents, go right into the same standard of living that my parents had when I graduated from high school, even though it took them 30 years to get there. I ought to be there right now. And on top of that, Bono should be proud. We think that we want it all, and so we want God to show us how to get there. By and large, my grandparents' generation, your grandparents' generation did not think this way. It would be a great homework assignment to talk to your grandma and grandpa if you still have them around. I did this when I was writing the book. And you talk to, especially that World War II generation, and you ask them, hey, Gramps, were you fulfilled in life? And it's like you're talking a different language. Because you are. This was so good for me when I was in a little town in Iowa, lots of old farmers there. You'd ask them these sort of questions, were you fulfilled? And they would just stare at you and say, well, I had something to eat. I had a job, and the Lord gave us children, and had a good church, and I never really thought about being fulfilled. Now, again, there's maybe some danger on that side, that our grandparents' generation could be maybe unreflective about life. It made for some quietly unhappy marriages, and they didn't talk about each other. They didn't, get into their emotions, and there's some problems there. But the good part was they said, look, I had a job, I ate, I lived, I raised my family, I went to church, I was thankful. What more would I want? But we are looking for a perfect job that has that lets you live in a wonderful place with culture and diversity, and yet you're close to the mountains and to the ocean, and you have a family, and you have great sex, and you have wonderful kids, and you have the most amazing church, and it's like John Piper preaching to you, but it's only 60 people, and it's real tight, and you know everyone, and the potluck food is always good, and you just think, God, would you just tell me how to get there? Fourth reason we search, we are desperate for God's will. We have too many choices. I think this is the number one reason Young people are desperate to find God's will. We have too many choices. Our preoccupation with the will of God is in many ways a Western, middle-class phenomenon of the last 50 years. I haven't done an exhaustive study, but it would be interesting to go back prior to 50 years ago and see if you could find these Will of God books. When I wanted to do this one, Just Do Something, the publisher was skittish at first, said, I don't know, there are so many Will of God books that have been written. 50, 60, certainly 100 years ago, I don't think you would have found it. Because what you have, people grew up probably on a farm, and they maybe went to school through 8th grade, maybe through high school, and then when they were done, what were they going to do? They were probably going to work on the farm. Maybe the woman would be a teacher. There was a few other things they could do, but they were going to probably stay in the town that they were born. And who would they marry? I think I once heard this statistic that 100 years ago, you had roughly maybe 7 to 12 eligible people that you might realistically marry. People about your same age that you would come in contact with and you weren't related to. That's always an important piece. Not related to. Well, think about it now. You think, there's 7 to 12 people in this room. And you have over 1,000 people here. And then you got Facebook and you got the internet. And you're going to meet just thousands of people. And we can go to school anywhere and major in dozens or hundreds of things and live in almost any place we want. And so many of the old people I talked to, they started working when they were teenagers and they did just whatever they could find. They worked for their dad or they worked in the harvest. And ironically, they got more done because they had fewer options. But now we have almost limitless options before us. And because of those hundreds of restaurants and thousands of careers, we are desperate for somebody. God, could you tell us what we're supposed to do? There's a really great book called The Paradox of Choice by Barry Schwartz. He's not a Christian as far as I can tell, but it's a good book. And he talks about a trip to his local, moderately sized grocery store. Not even the Uber Sam's Club or something. Just a moderately sized grocery store. And he found there 285 varieties of cookies, 13 sports drinks, 65 box drinks, 85 kids' juices, 75 iced teas, 95 types of chips, 15 kinds of water. How much water? 15 types of water, 80 different pain relievers, 40 options for toothpaste, 150 lipsticks, 360 types of shampoo, 90 different cold remedies, 230 soups. I only can think of about 2 soups I would want to eat. 75 instant gravies, 275 varieties of cereal, 22 types of frozen waffles, 64 types of barbecue sauce. That's unbelievable. That's why my wife doesn't let me go shopping. Hon, I want to help you out. Can I just go to the store? You don't know what you're doing, Kevin. I said, I can get it, right? Just get some baby food? No, it needs to be Harvest or Gerber's or Step 2 or Step 3, and I want this size. There's so many choices that husbands are just absolutely clueless. Have you ever taken someone from the two-thirds world out to eat at an American restaurant? We had a missionary from our church from Niger, which Niger is one of, if not the poorest country in the world. And we took him to Applebee's. Not exactly like the best cuisine in the whole world. You probably don't even allow them in Santa Barbara. But where I'm from, it's a nice treat to go out to Applebee's. So we went there, and admittedly he didn't speak English very well. We tried to help understand. But you could tell it was the menu was just too much to take in. And he just said, I want meat. Okay, we'll get you a steak. And then we said, he's going to have a steak. How does he want it cooked? I said, how do you want it cooked? I said, just so it doesn't move. He wants a steak. Then when they came back, and I didn't know Applebee's was this fancy, they said, sir, would you cut into your steak, please? They wanted to see if it was made to his liking, and he just picked up his knife, and what am I supposed to do? He said, just cut into your steak, see if we've prepared it correctly. He starts kind of waving around the knife. I said, I'm sure it'll be fine. I was talking once with another missionary who is an American who was coming back from the mission field, and he said, you know what is one of the hardest things about coming back to the States? There are too many salad dressings. So I go to a restaurant and I just say, I'll have a salad dressing. Yeah, what would you like? Balsamic vinaigrette or ranch or light ranch or creamy ranch or ranch vinaigrette balsamic or, there's 15 different things. I don't know, just wet, something that makes salad taste good. It doesn't taste good on its own. There's so many choices, and so it's no surprise that we would think that the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. We'd always be pondering, well, what should we do? What might be nicer? The word decide etymologically comes from the Latin word decidere, which means to cut off. A decision is cutting off. This helps explain why decisions are painful. This is the great paradox. We think the land of opportunity, you can do anything you want. But if we're honest, decisions are painful because if you can do A, B, C, or D, that's just 4 decisions. If you say yes to A, you are, by implication, saying no to B, C, and D. So every decision feels bad more than it feels good. Well, I just said yes to the internship, but that means I'm not going to school, and I'm not trying out this job, and I'm not moving to Chicago. And so you said no to a whole bunch of things. You said yes to one. You've cut off all those other things. And so what happens? We become very passive, hesitant. And it feels better to not decide anything. Now, I haven't said yes to A, but I haven't said no to B, C, or D. And so we end up not making decisions. Or if we do make a decision, we end up like my wife with shoes. I love my wife. She never likes the shoes that she brings home. First of all, I don't understand why women like shoes, but I'm just learning that they do, and I try to tell my wife, it's not what guys are looking at, okay? The shoes. But okay, it's important to you. You want the shoes. Not what I'm asking for you, but okay, you want, and invariably, I don't know. I think I don't like this color. Do you think I should have got the other one? Do you think these others would look? I'm just sort of in my mind just kind of flipping a coin, yes or no. Yes. You don't even know what I'm asking. No. I don't know. I can't make a decision about shoes. I just wear these. I don't know. I don't have to wear socks, and that feels nice. And we're like that with big decisions. We get buyer's remorse. We get regret. So we make a decision. And I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. And I missed out on God's best. And so we end up, our liberty feels more like bondage, and our decision-making feels like pain instead of pleasure. That's 4. 5th, let me give you one more reason. We are desperate to find God's will because many of us, if truth be told, are cowardly. Remember the story of Esther? Mordecai, her uncle or cousin or whatever the relation was. Mordecai finds out that there's this plot to kill the Jews. And of course, Esther is a Jew, and Mordecai is a Jew, and Esther is the queen. And so he gives this famous speech, and she says, well, I can't do it. No, you can't just come to the king. He has to give you the golden scepter. He has to beckon you to come. If you just come to the king unannounced, unbidden, you can lose your head. It's against the law. And he says, well, for such a time as this. And she's finally persuaded. And do you remember what Esther says? She says, she will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And then she says these words, and if I perish, I perish. Now that's a man, a woman. If I perish, I perish. Notice what she did not do? Mordecai, good point. Let me sit on this for about a month and lay out a couple fleeces. Let me see what I kind of just, if it feels right. Or you know what, Mordecai, I don't really feel at peace with this. And I feel like God's maybe telling me that I don't want to be killed. And so I'm not going to do it. No, she didn't do any of that. She's not looking, she's not expecting God to give her a sign. She's not expecting that God will tell her that everything will turn out right. Isn't at the root, that's why we want to know God's will. God, tell me what to do so I can be assured that this step will turn out well for me and it will lead to pleasure and not to pain, and that my life, Lord, just that my life will turn out fine. And God does not give us that assurance. He promises us He will work everything according to His will. He promises that He will make us more and more like Christ, which is the best good. But sometimes we have to say, Lord, if I perish, I perish. I may die. There's no writing in the sky. So we need courage. We need to be willing to risk. We can risk because God doesn't risk. Some people like to say, well, God is a risky God. No, God knows everything. He doesn't take risks. But because He knows everything and superintends everything, we can risk. Obsessing over the future is not how God wants us to live, because showing us the future is not God's way. His way is to speak in the Scriptures, transform us by the renewing of our minds. He does not mean to give us a crystal ball. He means to give us wisdom. And so we should stop expecting that God would show us the future and remove all risk from our lives, and we should start looking to God and have confidence that even if He does not tell us the future, we believe that He holds the future. And so we can have courage.